The Who's at home.
Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. Before I talk about this week's episode, The Doctor's Daughter, I need to talk about a couple of things that I completely forgot to talk about last week. You're probably way ahead of me in guessing what those are. The first, of course, is Rose's appearance on the monitor screen on board the TARDIS. Rose only appears for a fraction of a second and she appears to be saying Doctor, but of course she's in silence. Yet another tiny reference building up to the end of the season. The other thing is something more of a personal point. When the Atmos system is referred to as the Atmos system, and it annoys the guy who invented it, it just reminded me of my own personal rant at people who say PIN number, personal identification number, for chip and pin. But you know, it doesn't really matter. This week's podcast is dedicated to James Johnson from Big Lake, USA. Thanks for contributing to the running of the Tin Dog Podcast. Thanks, James. And so onwards to talk about The Doctor's Daughter. For an entire week, Doctor Who forums had been alive with chat. You see, in the classic series, we really didn't know that much about the Doctor's family. But we did know some things. We knew that the Doctor was a granddad. Indeed, many people might think he is the original grandfather from the Grandfather Paradox, but that's for the end of this conversation rather than the beginning. Susan was the first Doctor's first companion. Now some people would say that an adopted granddaughter. However, in the 5 Doctors, when the first Doctor and Susan meet up once again after all these years, she's the one who says, "Look, Doctor, we're on Gallifrey." Which means she is from Gallifrey and has a knowledge of the place. Well, to me. Other people may argue otherwise. Now Susan left the Doctor after the story The Daleks' Invasion of Earth. She's in the year 2200 and something. We were never quite completely sure when it was, but it was definitely the future in London. And as far as the TV audience is concerned, that's where she still is. So the fact that she may have died in the Time War is just interesting. And so that's the Doctor's granddaughter, which implies that he has children, resulting in the next generation. Colin Baker's Doctor talked about an uncle, while the 3rd Doctor sometimes talked about his childhood. It's the 2nd Doctor who says,
"You probably can't remember your family."
Oh yes, I can when I want to, but that's the point really. I have to really want to bring them back in front of my eyes. The rest of the time they sleep in my mind, and I forget, and so will you. Oh yes, you will. You'll find there's so much else to think about, to remember. Our lives are different to anybody else's. That's the exciting thing. Nobody in the universe can do what we are doing.
That gives us an insight to the perhaps sad background or possible death of his family. But that was all we knew until Doctor Who came back. Again, we have the 9th Doctor saying things like,
"My entire planet died. My whole family. Do you think it never occurred to me to go back and save them?"
And even the 10th Doctor, in his first meeting with Martha, mentions that he had a brother. But perhaps the biggest thing was when the Doctor tells Rose,
"Easy for you to say, you don't have kids."
I was a dad once.
What did she say?
This all makes us think that this modern interpretation of the Doctor has a whole family, or had a whole family. And so when we knew that the story was called The Doctor's Daughter, we really expected there to be the possibility of some more in-depth work on the Doctor's past. And so that's what the forums were talking about, working out how and who and what could have happened. Eventually, because of last week's fixation on the bubbling hand in a jar, people started to think that it was something to do with cloning, and perhaps that's closer than we thought we'd be. I think the cleverest thing about this story, that almost everything we saw at the end of last week's story was covered in the first minute or so of this week's. in a pre-title sequence we end up with the Doctor's daughter. We can accept, no matter how we feel about the past and the Doctor's family, that this is a perfectly acceptable narrative device to have a character called the Doctor's daughter without her ever having to be Gallifreyan or even a Time Lord. The matter of how Gallifreyans reproduce is something that was covered in great depth in other novels, in spin-off things, CDs and the like. For example, the novel Lungbarrow, which marks the end of the Seventh Doctor's book run, near enough, describes a Gallifrey where whole families are created using genetic material in something called a loom. Because children aren't born on Gallifrey, they have extended families, very much along the lines of Gormenghast, dark, brooding areas, which implies that the Doctor's surname, if he had a family name, would be Lungbarrow, although the family did tend to call him Snail as a pet name, on the grounds that he had a belly button and nobody else did. It's a lovely little sideline, but not really worth going into. But because we didn't have Doctor Who for so long, we started believing that the books were so much more important than they actually were. And so a lot of people are hanging on to this whole loom theory, and that's where we get lost, because it doesn't really matter. The Doctor had a family, the Doctor doesn't have a family anymore as far as we know, and now we have the Doctor's daughter. You see, I, like many of the old school fans, have got caught up in that aspect of the story. And if you remove the Doctor's daughter aspect of the whole narrative, you end up with a nice little story about the Doctor and his companions landing on a world that seems to be at war. They solve the war, they move on. It's a reworking of lots of different very old school Doctor Who stories, and it's particularly well done. Alright, the use of the Star Trek II style Genesis device would probably have been more impressive if the Doctor had launched it into the atmosphere rather than just smashing it on the floor. I've yet to come across any technology that works best by being dropped, but that's just me being picky. This is a great story. The whole 7-day war thing isn't really needed. If people believe that the other person is the enemy, it doesn't really matter how long the war's been going on. How one character is older than the others only really gets on your nerves if you start thinking about it, and let's face it, a lot of things in Doctor Who will kind of make you wonder if you start thinking about it. Don't look too long, don't stare. It's just a great story. Don't think about it too much because you'll start spotting holes. Why would robots build old-fashioned theatres and even include rust? I've got no real issues with this at all. The robots are building places with character, and who's to say how long a day actually lasts? There were some lovely little continuity touches. Things like the translator circuits appearing, to me, to translate the Hath's words for Martha, but not for us, the audience, in the way that Han Solo understands Chewbacca. Now, admittedly, on the commentaries from the BBC, Russell T Davies doesn't really see this straight off. But as a member of the audience, that's how I see it, and that's my show, I'm allowed to talk about it. The cloning device that makes Jenny and all of the troops seems very much so like the cloning device from last week's Sontaran story to also produce clothing. But I suppose if you can make a person, making clothes is really kind of secondary. The fact that children are born with eyeliner is also something let's not dwell on too much. Jenny's performance is strong, well acted, well performed, and if ever there was going to be a spin-off of the series that looked a bit too much like Buffy, this would be it. The Doctor's daughter, Jenny Who. Well, let's not call it that. But all of the fans who are living in fear of yet another spin-off can kind of relax a little bit because she's actually got a job somewhere else. She's working on what looks to be a very successful series, a spin-off of the series Spooks, which I believe in America is called something like MI5, which is odd because spooks is a term coined by Americans to mean spies. Let it go, it's not important. As has been well documented almost everywhere, the actress playing Jenny is the real-life daughter of Peter Davison. She's also the real-life daughter of Peter's then-wife, who played Trillian in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you follow that logic through, not only is she the Doctor's daughter, but she's also Random Dent, Trillian's daughter in the novels. That makes her possibly the most fantastic sci-fi progeny going. Again, we are presented with a great story, with great things for Donna to do. Donna is a very impressive character in this. She talks about the child support agency a little bit too much for my liking, implying she's from an estate slightly worse than the one that it looked like on TV. This series is going from strength to strength, and it's something I'm particularly pleased with. Now, before I go, I just want to remind you of some DVD releases that are coming out very soon. The vanilla, or non-enhanced version, of the first 3 episodes of Season 4 will be available at the beginning of next month. Well worth seeing because they are 3 great stories. Also available is the almost Sontaran story, Invasion of Time. The Invasion of Time is a 6-part Doctor Who story that for the life of me I can't work out why it is loved so much by fans of classic Who, myself included. Like most 6-parters in the Tom Baker era, it consists mainly of a 4-part story followed by a 2-part story linked by a theme. Now it's called The Invasion of Time, but really this is not part of the Time War. The fact that it's got the Sontarans in it in parts 5 and 6 really isn't that much of a surprise on the grounds that they're on the box. You're not quite sure who is invading Gallifrey. You're not quite sure of a lot of things when you're watching this. You're not quite sure why Leela decides to stay on Gallifrey with Andred, but she does. My only major memory of this from when I was a child was that K9 Mark 1 left and is promptly replaced by K9 Mark 2 in a cardboard box, but of course I'm getting ahead of myself. The basic plot is kind of spurious. The Doctor makes a deal with some unseen aliens, travels to Gallifrey, and promptly lets them invade. You don't really know what side the Doctor's on, and then some shimmering, not particularly well done aliens turn up. On this DVD, however, you do have the option of replacement special effects. I suggest if you do buy this DVD, you switch those on straight away, because the Vardens, the people trying to invade Gallifrey, look so much better this way. Admittedly, their strange squeaky voices haven't been fixed, but you can kind of let that go. They have skeletal appearances, sort of like electricity, and the other slightly touched up effects really help with the whole film. This story was pulled out of the hat at the last minute. Another script had fallen through, and the scriptwriter wrote this story under the pseudonym David Agnew, the same pseudonym that Douglas Adams would eventually use for The City of Death. Like many Doctor Who stories, it looks better and feels better as long as you don't think about it too much. By the time the Sontarans do turn up, you're wondering really what's going on. You do kind of feel sorry for the Sontarans, there's only a handful of them, and they spend most of the time wandering around trying to find someone called Doctor, when of course the Doctor's going around calling himself the President. Something worthy of note, however, is some of the extra performances. There isn't a weak performance in the entire show. In fact, I was rather impressed by the actress playing Rodan, who could quite easily, if the show was shown today, be the 1970s version of Sally Sparrow. We get to see a lot of Gallifrey, and that we have to be grateful for, mainly because the costumes in the set was left over from The Deadly Assassin. And what else do you get with this? Well, the extras disc has a very nice history of Gallifrey. There are some deleted scenes, mostly running around, and there's the classic Talking Heads making of. There's a short documentary, mockumentary about who is David Agnew, which is well intentioned, doesn't quite pull it off. We've seen much better things from the restoration crew. As a child, one of the things I did love about this story was we got to see a lot of the inside of the TARDIS. We got to see lots of other rooms. We got to see the swimming pool, we got to see the workshop. Admittedly, all of these things were filmed in a rather dilapidated hospital, and the brickwork doesn't really make sense. But again, you can let that go. It's worth seeing, and especially with the tarted up SFX, I'd recommend this one to any fan of the Sontarans. Before I go, there was one thing I didn't mention, which worried me a little bit in this week's Doctor Who. Donna implies that she's quite willing to travel with the Doctor for as long as he'll have her, which sounded very much like a scene from one of those old war movies where the guy starts saying the things he'll do when he gets home after the war. Things usually go pear-shaped for any character who says something like that. It's a shame, but something I'm sure we'll come to terms with. Be seeing you. You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended. Contact us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk.